tell a story. And everybody likes stories. I like stories. You like stories. Man, that's why we watch movies, right? That's why we read books, because we like stories. When my son, who was sitting up here, was little, I used to make up stories. We'd lay down at night, put him to bed, and he'd tell me stories. So the story always had to begin, usually, with, once upon a time, there was a good little boy named, and he would say, Sean. And I'd go, no, Egbert, or something like that. And he'd go, no, Sean. So one night I lay down and I started a story that wasn't about Sean. But let me tell you a couple of rules about stories. See, for a story to be good, it has to have a couple of very basic things. The first thing is it has to have some kind of point of understanding. You know, the people you're telling the story to have to understand what you're talking about. I can't lay down next to my 6-year-old and say, let me tell you a story about string theory and quantum mechanics.
Why not?
Because he wouldn't get it. Now you might. When you were 6, maybe you got it. He wouldn't get it. So it has to be something that he would understand. Something that's part of his knowledge and his experience. That's the first rule. The second rule is it has to be something that he's interested in. I'll give you an example. Right? The one time that we lay down and I said, once upon a time, there was a good little girl. And the girl and the pony were playing in a field of wildflowers. And he went, Dad, that's not a good story. Now, he has some point of understanding, right? He knows what a girl is. He knows what wildflowers are. He knows what a pony is, He has some field of knowledge, but he has no point of interest. He doesn't care at 6 years old about girls and ponies and wildflowers. So, I was losing my audience right there, because it was not something he was interested in. So I used that magic word that all little boys want to hear when you're telling a story. I said, suddenly. And he went, suddenly what? And I said, well, once upon a time, there was a good little girl. And the good little girl had a pony. And the good little girl and the pony were playing in a field of wildflowers. And then suddenly, a Tyrannosaurus Rex came stomping out of the forest and stomped on the flowers and ate the pony. And he went, yeah, that's a good story. Suddenly, he had some interest in that kind of story. Now, really good stories have a third point. And the third point is that there is a point. There's a moral or a lesson to it. And the moral of the lesson of the story is if you're going to go to the park and play in the wildflowers, it should not be Jurassic Park. That's the point of the story. Now, Jesus told stories. He told a lot of stories that people I don't think quite understood. He was a very subversive guy. Why did they kill him? They didn't kill him because he was nice and lovely. They killed him because he was pretty subversive. He said some things that not only kicked off the ruling party, everybody got kind of aggravated with him, frankly. So if 2,000 years ago he told stories that they didn't understand, the truth of the matter is some of this stuff we don't understand either. So we really need to dig into his stories and look at them as a first century Jew, because that's who he talked to. It's in their field of understanding, not ours. So when we look at his stories, we need to understand that. What does a first century Jew understand it to mean? And then how does that apply to us? Now we're going to look at a very short little parable he told in Luke chapter 13. Only 2 verses. It's Luke 13, 18 through 19. So if you want to turn to that, you can. Or you can just listen to me read it because it's kind of short. You don't have to worry about it. And this story, like most of Jesus' stories, had a point. It was about something that they were very interested in, and also was something that they really needed to hear even if they didn't understand it. So let me read to you these 2 verses. Wow, you know what? It helps if you clean your glasses too. That's scary. Luke 13, 18 through 19. These really don't help a whole lot. Here it is. Then Jesus asked, what is the kingdom of God like? What shall I compare it to? It is like a mustard seed which a man took and planted in his garden. It grew and became a tree, and the birds of the air perched in its branches. Now, like I said, we have to hear this as a first century Jew would hear it. So I want to go through it and kind of explain step by step. Here's kind of what they understood him to be saying. And the first thing Jesus says is of real interest to them. It's the reason why they would stop and listen. When he said the kingdom of God is like. They were very interested in the kingdom of God. The Jews at this time are under Roman rule. They are an occupied nation. And they don't like being an occupied nation. Frankly, you don't want a foreigner telling you what to do, where to go, how to live. But that's what was going on. the Jews believed that one day God would physically come back in the form of the Messiah, overthrow the Roman Empire or whoever else was in charge at that time, because they spent a lot of time, being an occupied nation. If it wasn't the Romans, before them was the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So they were waiting for God to come back, show up, overthrow all of them, and make them the chief among the nations. It's kind of like God was going to come down and be president, and the Jewish nation was going to be vice president, and everybody else was under them. And this is what they're expecting. It's what they're living for. So the kingdom of God is really important to them. It is a real physical, political, socio-economic rule is what they're looking for from God. So Jesus starts with that. The kingdom of God is like, and they all go, yes, we want to know what the kingdom of God is like. And he says something that they don't quite get. He says the kingdom of God is like this mustard seed. Now to them, it doesn't make sense. A mustard seed is this little small thing. If you're going to, in a Jewish mind, if you're going to compare the kingdom of God to something, you're going to compare it to something great, something majestic, something, in a plant kingdom like the cedars of Lebanon. Lebanon is this other country, kind of northwest of them, that's known for its forests. Trees that are 300 foot tall, big, majestic, awe-inspiring things. And isn't God big, majestic, and awe-inspiring? You would think, right, if you're going to compare God and his rule over the world like something, you compare it to something like that. Not a little tiny mustard seed. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So they're interested in this thing, but they're not sure it's what they want. Mustard seed is small. But also mustard is a weed in Palestine. This is something that grew all over the place. All over the hillsides you could find mustard. It grew wild, and it was useful. They used mustard for its oil. They used it as a spice, as we would. They also would crush it up, make a paste out of it, and use it as like an ointment, a healing balm. So mustard had its uses, but it started out this really small thing and grew into a weed, not a cedar of Lebanon. So it's confusing. Now he says something that really aggravates everybody. And this is the point I think we don't understand when we read the story until we really dig into history. He says, the kingdom of God's like this mustard seed that a man went and planted in his garden. Now, in the Jewish mind, that's against the law. Let me read something to you. The Jews had the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that kind of laid out for them how life should be. Then they also had these other books written about the first 5 books that kind of explained it. For example, one of the 10 Commandments is remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. They took that to mean don't work on the Sabbath day. The problem with that command is what's work? So they had these 2 books. It's called the Mishnah and the Talmud that kind of explain all these things. And it wound up, the 10 Commandments becoming 630 some odd, I think, rules that the Jewish people live by. So work, if I walk across the road to the neighbor's house, does that work? Or is that okay? If I walk 2 more blocks, does that work? No kidding. There was a rule about work that was related to spitting. If you spit 2 foot, that wasn't work. But if you hopped on 4 foot away, that was work. And you sinned. I'm not making that up. That's true. So they had rules for everything. And here's a rule. This is in the Mishnah. I'm going to read it to you word for word, right out of the Mishnah. It says, no kind of seed may be sown in a garden bed, but any kind of vegetable may be sown. Mustard and small beans are deemed a kind of seed, and large beans a kind of vegetable. Mustard seeds and small beans, even though they be planted and used as vegetables, may not be planted in a garden. So Jesus is telling them, break the law, right? He's saying, first off, God's kingdom is like this really small thing. Well, that's offensive to a Jew. Now he's saying it's planted in a garden. It's not just offensive, it's illegal. It's against the law. You get kicked out of the synagogue for doing these things. You have to go through all kinds of ritual cleaning. And your garden is no longer, you can't eat anything out of the garden now because you planted mustard in it. This is a serious problem, and Jesus is saying, do this. So, think like a first century Jew. You're saying, you're listening to me going, what? Is he serious? What is he saying? Is he saying that the coming Messiah, that is going to establish Israel as the kingdom over all kingdoms, that reign, our proper place in the world, is going to be this small, insignificant, unwanted, weedy kind of thing that's actually unlawful? That doesn't make sense to a first century Jew. Now it gets even worse. Jesus goes on and says they're going to plant a mustard seed in a garden, illegal, insignificant, that's going to become a tree. Now every first century Jew knew mustard did not become a tree. Now, mustard seeds could grow up to 15 foot tall. There are fields of it all over the place in Palestine. And it could grow really tall. But it was more like, have you seen, bamboo around here? It's on the side of the street. It's really tall but thin. It was even thinner than that. Just kind of tall, spindly things. But usually mustard seed at the maximum was this 3 or 4 foot bush kind of thing. It was a weed. It could be a really tall weed, but it certainly did not become a tree. So they've got to be looking at Jesus like, what are you saying? This doesn't make any sense. You're insulting our intelligence. We want God to come as this majestic person who's going to destroy our enemies and set us up as rulers of the world. You're saying God's going to come in some very small, insignificant, illegal kind of way. It's going to be totally foreign. It doesn't make sense at all. This absurd idea that a mustard is going to become a tree. One last thing he says, the birds will come nest in its branches. Now, how many of you plant gardens? All right, one. Okay, I'll talk to you. Birds are not good in your garden. We have blueberries. Now, if you have gone to Lynn Villa and picked blueberries, or if you have blueberries, you know you have to keep birds away from blueberries because they'll go into your bush and they'll eat every single one of them. So you have to put a net around them. Birds are not useful for your garden. They eat things, they destroy things. So birds are bad. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you want birds in your garden? You understand what Jesus is doing to these people? He's really messing with them. He's telling them things that just plain don't make sense, that are wrong in their view.